Hi, I'm Liz Grier. I live in Exeter with my husband, my sons, some cats, some chickens and a duck, and I'm currently at Trinity College Bristol training to be a vicar. But before that, well, a long time before that, I got a PhD in condensed matter physics. So joining you today to talk on my two favourite subjects is an absolute joy. So I grew up in a scientific family. I have two older sisters, and honestly, being the third was quite difficult. They did everything really well. They played in every sports team. They played in every orchestra and musical group that was going. They got great A-level results, went to great unis, and I just was desperate to be a little bit different, just to be noticed. So they did biology and chemistry, which left me, I felt, with physics. Now, and I was all right at physics, so I thought, let's do that. Let's just be slightly different to what's gone before. It was a little bit risky because maths wasn't my best subject, but I went ahead anyway. But when I arrived at uni, I was in a bit of a mess. A series of things had happened in my late teens that left me feeling unlovable and unconfident and desperately unsure of myself. And science, I liked science. It was black and white. You knew where you were with it. But it didn't help me at all with the mess and the rubbish that was going on in my life. I was agnostic about God. I knew I'd got no idea. I knew really clearly that I was sitting on the fence, trying to keep him as a bit of an insurance policy. And that didn't really satisfy the scientist in me, because life was black and white. That's what I thought. And therefore there either was a God or there wasn't. I needed to do something about it, or I didn't. So I decided to look into who God said he was. And what I found blew my mind. I found people who not only believed that there was a God, but said that they knew him, that they were talking to him, that he wasn't this aloof, distant thing sitting on a fluffy cloud that I'd got in my head, but that he was involved and that he cared. And that led me to look at Jesus. Now, my best friend at school had looked into Jesus, and she'd come to the conclusion and convinced me that actually Jesus was just a good teacher and he wasn't God. As someone said to me, it was from C.S. Lewis, but if you really look at who Jesus said he was, he didn't leave open to you the option of saying that he's a good teacher, and he didn't intend to. So I knew that then I had to look at who Jesus said he was. So I did. I went and read the Bible, and I looked at the evidence, and I found some overwhelming evidence. There's loads of stuff out there that tells me historically that Jesus really did live and die and rise again. Scientifically, I couldn't deny him anymore. I didn't have all the answers. I still had loads of questions. I didn't understand creation or suffering or any of those things, and God didn't really want me to get to that point. I could see loads of scientists around me who were Christians. They didn't seem to have any conflict between the two, and that encouraged me. And that was when I knew I had to make this leap of faith. God had brought me to this point, and now it was up to me. So I did. I said, God, I believe. And that was 27 years ago. And since then, God's been showing himself more and more of himself every day. It's been an amazing time. My friends at the time at uni didn't approve. They thought I was crazy. They thought I was never going to make it as a scientist and a Christian. But I've never once found a moment of conflict. Science has brought me closer to God, and God has made me appreciate science even more. But I still frequently get asked the question, how can I believe in God whilst working as a scientist? You may think that God and science have always been in conflict, but that's not actually the case. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. It was in the 18th century, in the age of enlightenment, when there came this sort of thinking that any knowledge worth having was from rational thought, was from reason, and when faith began to be questioned. It was in the 19th century that Nietzsche said, God is dead, science has done away with God. Before that, science and faith got on really quite well. There was the odd skirmish, and we will get to Galileo later, but actually they supported and complemented each other. Francis Bacon, who is regarded as the father of modern science, in the 16th century said God had given us two books, the book of the Word, which is the Bible, and the book of works, which is creation, and you needed to study them both for the fullest understanding. Many of the thinkers who laid the foundations for modern science had a belief in God, and it was this belief in God that gave them the confidence that the physical world, in all its complexity, could be understood. They saw no contradiction between faith and the utmost excellence in rational thinking. As C.S. Lewis said, men became scientists because they expected law in nature. They expected law in nature because they believed in the lawgiver. Because if you think about it, it's not a necessary condition of existence that we can describe the universe with elegant mathematics. If there was no rational creator, why would it not be underlying random and chaos? Einstein famously said, "The only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible." But the universe does follow elegant mathematical laws. And the more I studied physics, the deeper I got into the subject, the more I saw an elegant simplicity. As a Christian, I began to glimpse a God who is an amazing physician and mathematician. In fact, I believe that science works because the universe and the human minds are ultimately the product of the same divine mind. As humans, we're made in the image of God. Even Stephen Hawking, who was an atheist, was led to ask, what is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? So perhaps in the 21st century, we can push back on that naivety that says God is dead, God is out, and turn to thinking that says science brings back God. If you Google it as I did, the argument is quite loud and it's polarised at the minute, and it's the voices at the edge that are talking the loudest. You've got the new atheists on one side and the new creationists on the other. But the situation has been changing over the last 20 years since I was a student. There's a lot more conversation in the middle, which is brilliant, because having to choose between faith and science is ridiculous. It's like asking people to choose between Henry Ford and the theory of internal combustion as an explanation for the motor car. It doesn't make sense as a question. For any real discussion about God and faith, we're going to have to look at the Bible. Now, obviously, the Bible isn't a science textbook, but some people go further than that and say it's anti-scientific, that it actually goes against the science we know today, or that it's unscientific, that it just no longer fits with the scientific worldview that we now understand. But I want to suggest that it's neither. It's just non-scientific. Its main message isn't to tell us how things work. It is a communication from God. It's God trying to let us know a little bit of what he's like. The Bible looks at people, the world and life, just as science does, but from a different angle. Science is trying to understand how things work, but it has its limits. It can't tell me whether James loves me. It can't tell me about how beautiful this garden is. It can't tell me why a piece of music moves my heart. But none of those things aren't true. It's just looking from a different angle. Let me illustrate that. When it rains and then the sun shines, when light shines through raindrops, the constituent colours of light get separated out by the raindrops. They're diffracted into red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo and violet. And you get a semicircular bow in the sky. It's a rainbow. That's the scientific explanation of what's going on. But can I also tell you that it's beautiful? Well, yeah, that's non-scientific, but it's not unscientific. As a Christian, I might also add that it's revealing a glimpse of God's glory to me. I can't prove either of the last two interpretations, but that doesn't mean they aren't true. So the Bible is not a science textbook. It's looking at life from a different angle. But neither is it a history textbook or a book of poetry. It's better to understand it as a library full of books with a range of genres. And just as when you take a book out from the library, you need to understand what you're reading. You can't take a science fiction book and read it as a science textbook, or a horror novel and read it as an autobiography. So you need to understand what you're reading when you read the Bible. And there are a load of Bible scholars and theologians who are out there helping us read the Bible better. But I also think science can contribute to this conversation. Now, historically, that hasn't always gone very well for scientists, but if we could learn from the past, I think there's a lot that science and faith could help each other. So, for example, in Psalm 93 we read, "The world is firmly established, it cannot be moved." Now, at the turn of the 17th century, Christians were reading this psalm as a piece of science. They thought it was a fact. Galileo was a Catholic, but as a scientist he was also convinced by the work of Copernicus that actually the earth wasn't fixed, but it was moving around the sky, around the sun. Galileo realised that Christians were misunderstanding what the Bible was teaching. Sadly, the church didn't want to hear it at the time, but his point was a good one. The Psalms weren't describing a scientific fact at that point, it was poetry. Galileo was getting back to the intention of the psalmist, who, although, yes, he may have thought that snow came from storehouses in heavens, he certainly didn't think that trees could clap their hands. It was poetic imagery. Now, similarly, Most people would say that Genesis 1 is a beautiful piece of Hebrew poetry, that it's completely unscientific. Many agnostics and atheists assume that it's in the creation story that I find the biggest tension between science and faith. But I don't. Interestingly, the Big Bang Theory was first suggested by a Catholic priest and scientist called Lemaitre. He didn't call it that. Actually, it was his scientific contemporaries who coined that phrase to discredit it because they thought it was such a silly idea. But I do accept you can't read about the Big Bang Theory in the Bible. But perhaps if you look harder, you'll see it implied in loads of ways. The Big Bang assumes that the universe was created from a single point, and before that there was nothing. The Hebrew Bible starts with, "In the beginning, God created." Both say there was a beginning. Lemaitre devised a theory to explain why all the galaxies were moving away from each other, which scientists could see. The Psalms tell us that God stretched out the heavens. One is looking at it scientifically, one is looking at it poetically and theologically. For Lemaitre, understanding the scientific origins of the universe did not detract from God at all. After the beginning, Genesis says the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. So if the earth did come from gases orbiting around the sun as we think it did, and then cooling to form first liquids and then solids, well, it would have been without form, just as the Bible suggests. On day 1, God created light and dark, which seems weird because it's not until day 4 that he creates the sun, moon and stars. But perhaps it's not weird. If a young hot earth is surrounded by masses of water vapour, it would have been like the worst English summer ever. It would have been clouds all the way. You wouldn't have been able to see the sun, but you would have known when there was light and when there was dark. It was only later, as the clouds began to clear, that you would have seen the sun and the moon from the earth. On day 2, God separated the skies and the waters on earth. When the earth is really hot, any water falling on it would have evaporated instantly, but as it began to cool, the water falling would have started to settle, to lie on the surface, so that the water vapour in the sky and the waters on the land would begin to be separated. On day 3, God created the land and the sea. As the earth cooled, it would shrink and buckle, so dry land and oceans would appear. It was becoming a place where life could start. Now, absolutely, this process took place over billions of years rather than days, I think. But it still fits well with the image of an evolving Earth. And at this point, we've reached the primordial soup, the real precursors of living things. Billions of years ago, it exploded into life. And I wonder if at this point the order doesn't work quite so well, it doesn't fit. Plants are said to emerge on day 3 before the sun on day 4. I'm not sure about that, but it does mention plants before animals. And if you think about the food chain, the animals needed the plants to feed on, so that makes sense. And then we're told on day 5, sea creatures and birds are created. Now, from evolution, they didn't all happen at the same time. There was a process involved in that. But it happens before day 6, when on the land, animals and humanity were created. And we're pretty sure that animals evolved from those in the sea. So it's not a bad fit, and the overwhelming majority of scientists believe in the theory of evolution. And when that many really intelligent people believe a theory, you've got to think really hard before you can dismiss it. So I did that, and I found myself agreeing with the body of evidence. I think evolution is the mechanism by which God populated the earth and filled his creation. But I also want to add that I think there's something incredible about humans. We're not just any step in the evolutionary chain. We are made in the image of God. When God created humans, even though I think he did it through evolution, there was a moment when he breathed his spirit, his life, his ruach into us and brought us into special relationship with him. So I'll say it again. The Bible is not a scientific textbook. It tells us about the Creator and who he is. Genesis 1 is written as beautiful poetry. But when we reread it, I'm staggered by how amazingly it corresponds to the science I know. It corresponds in a way that was way beyond the writers of Genesis, and I'm blown away when I look at both the science and the poetry of that account. So every morning, my husband gets up before me and makes me a cup of tea. I'm very lucky. Now, If my sons were ever in the kitchen at that time, which they wouldn't be because they're teenagers, they could say to him, Dad, why is the kettle boiling? And James could reply, well, I flicked the switch, which completed a circuit, the electrons have flown round, they have heated the element has transferred its heat to the water has risen in temperature to 100 degrees, and it's now boiling. Or he could say, because I wanted to make Mum a cup of tea. Both of those answers are true. Both of them are looking at things from a different angle. Science is interested in function, but it doesn't look at purpose. But it doesn't mean there's no purpose. I can tell you how the kettle's boiling from a scientific point of view, but I can tell you why the kettle's boiling from James's intention. So science can tell me how the world was created. It can tell me the equations that govern planetary motion. It can develop drugs and vaccines. But it can't tell me why. It can't tell me why I was created. It can't tell me what I'm here for. For this, I believe, to understand the why of life, you need to have faith. Faith in a creator God who loves us, who has great plans for us, who cares for us, who's not disinterested in us. Mark Twain famously said that faith is believing what you know ain't so. Christopher Hitchens, another famous atheist author, said faith is the surrender of the mind. But Galileo said, I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who endowed us with senses, reason and intellect has intended us to forgo their use. He clearly linked faith and reason. Now the Bible says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Conviction here in the Greek is from the word elenkos, which means proof, proving or testing. Faith is testing things out that we can't see. It needs evidence and it has to work. And that doesn't sound anything like the faith that Twain and Hitchens were talking about. It's not believing against the evidence. When I became a Christian, yes, I had to take a leap of faith, but it was based on the evidence that I found surrounding the life of Jesus. And since that moment, God has been revealing himself to me every day. It's not been blind faith, but based on reason and experience. New atheists think that God is a scientific question, that you shouldn't need faith, that if there's a God, then he must be somewhere in the universe and we must be able to find him. And it's interesting that new atheists are so dismissive of faith, because you need faith to do science. I'm sure you've heard that Edison failed 1,000 times before he got that first light bulb to work. But also, think of the coronavirus vaccines. I'm told that before this year, 5 years to get a vaccine through development and working was really quite quick. And yet, the amazing scientists this year have done it in 11 months. And they are so excited that they're even better than they imagined. But they did it because they knew, they had faith that they could do it. I don't believe that the God that I read of in the Bible can be found by science. God is bigger than the universe. He's transcendent. He sits outside of the universe. When Solomon built the temple, the place that God was going to come and dwell on earth, he prayed to God, and what he said was, "But will God indeed dwell with man on earth? Behold, heaven in the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house I've built?" He knew that God couldn't be contained in the universe. He's not somewhere up there. He's outside the universe. He's completely different from it. But at the same time, he's everywhere. King David in Psalm 139 said, "Where can I go from your presence?" He knew that there was nowhere that he could escape from him. The prophet Jeremiah tells the people that God is everywhere. God says, "Do I not fill the heavens and the earth?" So I'm saying that both God is nowhere, he's outside the universe, but that he's everywhere. If it's outside the universe, we're never going to find him with science. I believe you could search everywhere, every planet, every galaxy, every plant, every proton, every quark. You could turn them all over and God is going to be nowhere to be found. But I believe he's everywhere at the same time. Now, nothing I've said gives you evidence that this is true, but it does show you that the God I believe in can't be proved or disproved by science. Faith helps us go behind science. It doesn't want us to ignore it, but it goes beyond what we can see and measure. God loves us being inquisitive and asking questions. So when my two children were tiny, they used to overwhelm me with, why, mummy, why? Why is the grass green? Why is the sky blue? Why is broccoli so disgusting? Questions like that. I remember one day being 10 minutes late for registration, which was an absolute no in their school, because I couldn't get Josh away from staring at the awesome wonderfulness to his childish eyes of a bumblebee. And I did stop and look at it with him, and I just thought, I don't do this enough. I raced past. And it's got me thinking, is that what the Bible says when it says we need to have a childlike faith, to be full of wonder? Does God want us to have an attitude that's full of curiosity, a humility that says, I don't know all the answers, but I really want to? So if God exists and we can't find him in science, then how do we find him? Well, now we need to look at Jesus, because it's Jesus who shows us what God is like. God, who's not part of the universe, stepped down into the universe to show us himself. God became part of the universe when he became man. He kind of steps into his own picture, but remains the artist. Do you ever get asked by your friends, well, if there's a God, why doesn't he show himself to me? Because I get asked that all the time. And Jesus' really simple answer to them, which I love, is, well, if you've seen me, then you've seen the Father. If you want to know about God, then you need to look at Jesus. Because the amazing thing is, God is not a theory, but he's a person. He's not someone to believe in, but someone who we can get to know and trust. Now, as I said before, I found out there's an overwhelming amount of historical evidence that Jesus lived and died and rose again. And if you don't know that, then go and do your research. Find out for yourself. But that made me stop and think, well, then if Jesus did live and die and rise again, then what does it mean for me? And it was life-changing. When I realised that Jesus and God weren't distant, that Jesus came and died on the cross for me, that God was not indifferent to my sufferings, but he came to live with me, then that changed everything. In his death and resurrection, I found total, unmerited forgiveness, and with his grace, I started to look at the mess in my life and move on and deal with it. It's been the journey of a lifetime, and we're not done yet, but the step of faith that I took was literally the best decision I ever made. There's more. Every day I learn more about God, and every day I have more questions. God is absolutely fine with that. So don't be afraid to bring your questions to God. Don't be intimidated by people who have other views to you. Listen to them, but hold on to the knowledge that faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see.